Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being here. And good morning to everyone. First of all, obviously I want to thank John for inviting me to speak. I want to thank my wife back there for being here, supportive of me. The pretty blonde behind you. I'm going to talk about the transpartisan imperative in American life, but first a question. Who's familiar with the word transpartisan?
Never heard of it.
I saw it. What have you heard that transpartisan means?
Well, when you were here last year...
Uh-oh. Unfair advantage.
Well, someone else can take it if they want.
No, it's all yours.
Well, when you were here last year, you said that transpartisanism was picking up on different groups' outcomes that they desired, and although their motivations could be different, they could all agree on a certain final solution to a problem, and that transpartisanism is finding out this practical goal and then grouping people together under that, so that way people with different ideologies can work toward the same end constructively.
That's point number 2. I'm done. Well said. The way I think about transpartisan, there's other people who think a little bit differently, but I have 4 pillars, and you've actually just hit number 2. 4 pillars are organizing around principles, organizing around policy, various types of processes in terms of how decisions are taken, and a way of mapping the body politic. And I'll just start with the first one, which is principles. And even before I get into that, let me just look at the word transpartisan. Trans means to move through and beyond. So transpartisan means to go through and beyond the partisan. The idea is that we are not looking at or encouraging people to necessarily change their worldview or their perspective. What we're doing is trying to create a bigger picture in which their worldview and perspective fits in a way of organizing them to ends that we seek, as you mentioned. One way of doing that is around principles. And I'll give you 2 examples of issues that I've worked on to these ends. Are you all familiar with the Patriot Act, I assume? Well, there was a great transpartisan coalition of libertarians, progressives, liberals, and conservatives who came together in opposition to certain provisions of the Patriot Act, which they saw as violating the 4th Amendment. These libertarians, progressives, conservatives, and liberals didn't have to agree on a whole bunch of other issues, means of attack on this issue. What they all agreed on was a certain set of principles our founding fathers espoused, in this case the 4th Amendment, and that brought everyone together in a broad coalition to oppose the Patriot Act in the beginning, oppose it, I think it was around 2005, 2006 when it was reauthorized, and then quite a few months ago, certain 3 provisions were reauthorized again. The same coalition came together in opposition. Unfortunately, we've lost those 3 battles, and the Patriot Act keeps getting reauthorized. There are slight changes over time, which are positive, but not as positive changes that we'd actually like to see. Another example of principled way of organizing principally is audit of the Federal Reserve. Are you all familiar with the Federal Reserve? Okay. Are you familiar of the audit of the Federal Reserve? Okay. Well, the Campaign for Liberty, which is Ron Paul's organization, hired me to help create a transpartisan coalition bringing liberals, conservatives, libertarians, and progressives together in support of a bill that Congressman Paul at the time had introduced, which would call for an audit of the Federal Reserve by the GAO. There was a bill introduced in the House by Congressman Paul and Congressman Grayson, who's the Democratic co-sponsor, and in the Senate, Senator Bernie Sanders, who's the socialist member of the Senate, and Jim DeMint, who's the very conservative member, introduced it. So you have Libertarian Ron Paul, Democratic Grayson, Socialist Bernie Sanders, and very conservative Jim DeMint. So you can see kind of the broad spectrum of folks supporting an audit of the Fed. What was interesting is that by the time we were done, we had 330 co-sponsors in the House, which is an amazing thing for 2 reasons. One is just an amazing number, especially for a Ron Paul bill, because Ron Paul has been pushing for an audit of the Fed for probably the 70s when he was first a member of Congress. And if you track it, you probably have like 1 or 2 people support it, and then maybe the next time he did it 3 or 4, but I don't think he ever got past 10. But because of the economic crisis that we faced and the Federal Reserve was in the news more and more, people started waking up to, wow, there's this kind of 4th branch of government that's doing things and affecting our money and bringing the value of the money down, and we need to kind of look into this. So there's a people's movement that started generating interest in the Federal Reserve, and because of that, Congress acted. In the Senate, we had 33 senators who supported an audit of the Fed. Now what happened in the end was the financial reform legislation that passed probably about 1.5 years ago had an audit in it. Now, it was a much reduced and modified version of Congressman Paul's and Grayson's bill. Apparently, Senator Sanders, in order to get it passed in the Senate, had to kind of play games with it and narrow it down a little bit, but it did pass. Now, let me ask you this, because I think this is quite telling of the lack of ability of our media to tell important stories. Who knows here what the audit showed? The GAO report just came out a week ago.
You've seen it.
Right. Now, this is kind of mind-blowing, and what I'm about to say comes from Senator Sanders' website, and I've only seen it in 3 other places. According to the GAO report, according to Senator Sanders, $16 trillion was loaned out by the Fed to foreign and domestic banks and foreign and domestic other financial institutions, including corporations. $16 trillion.
Ouch.
Now, that's a lot of money. And I haven't heard anyone talking about it except for Campaign for Liberty did a blog about it. I saw Raw Story do a blog about it. And I've been pushing the information out, and hopefully after this whole debt battle, we'll get some news about this. But it's really disturbing if you follow monetary policy to think what effect on the dollar $16 trillion being put into the system has, especially when the Federal Reserve was bailing out foreign banks and transnational corporations. So it's kind of mind-blowing, and hopefully over the next couple of months, more and more information will be released, and Americans will wake up to the fact of what the Federal Reserve has done, and hopefully some action will be taken. But it's quite telling and informative that all these people from across the political spectrum came together on the issue of transparency. They have a million different differences, but they came together on transparency, and the result is this modified audit of the Federal Reserve. So between the Patriot Act and the audit of the Federal Reserve are 2 examples of a principled way of organizing across the political spectrum to have some kind of solution. The first one was on civil liberties, and the second one was on transparency. A second way of organizing is around policy, and that's what my friend back there was mentioning. And I'll give you a few examples of thinking about how to organize around policy. And since you were here last year, you probably heard one of these stories. In Texas, in 2006 or 7, I think it was, there was an interest by the governor, Governor Perry, to mandate the HPV vaccine. This is the vaccine which would hopefully mitigate cancer for females. Now, I was part of an organization that I work for called the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, which promotes the private practice of medicine and opposes all third-party interference in the practice of medicine. They don't want government telling doctors how to practice medicine. They don't want insurance companies telling doctors how to practice medicine. So on their behalf, with another staffer, we helped organize a transpartisan coalition against the HPV vaccine mandate. Now, you might disagree, you might think it should be mandated, but let me just explain how we organized and our thinking. So, our doctors association do not like mandates. They just think it's inappropriate for medicine to be mandated for individuals. It's not the best way of doing medical practices. So theirs was more of a kind of a libertarian approach. Nothing should be mandated, everything should be voluntary. But we thought through, like, who else could be coalition partners? We found out that Perry's former chief of staff then was now working for the pharmaceutical company that would benefit from the mandate. So we went to a lot of our friends on the center left who opposed kind of the corporate welfare type angle. And we said, hey, look, this it's basically corporate welfare at the worst. It's like the former ex-aide goes to work for the company that benefits from this mandate. So we got a whole bunch of center-left kind of both good government and anti-corporate welfare groups to join us in this effort. We didn't have to convince them that the libertarian approach is the appropriate one in terms of opposing mandates. We also went to some transparency groups who says, well, wait, how's this communications going on between the former staffer and the present-day staffer and the pharmaceutical companies? This is kind of possibly very inappropriate. So from a transparency point of view, they're very interested in, like, well, what's going on here? We should slow this down and kind of look into this. So we got transparency groups involved. We also approached conservative pro-family groups who, for mostly religious purposes, thought it was very inappropriate to give the message, I should say, that 13-year-old girls should get this shot, which would allow them to be sexually active. They just thought that was a poor message to be given to girls, especially 13-year-old girls. So we got them involved in our coalition effort. Now, And then I think the last set of groups we got involved were medical and science groups who said, well, wait, the science does not necessarily support broad use of this vaccine. It hasn't been tested enough. We need to slow down, do a little bit more testing before you mandate it for, the whole population of young females. Because if in fact it's dangerous, the parents should know this before you mandate something. So all these various groups, we didn't have to convince them of the others' arguments. All we had to do is all agree that we oppose the vaccine mandate. And that allowed us all to come together without having to fight over turf and stuff. And that was, as I said, an example of coming together over a policy as opposed to like a Fourth Amendment set of principles and stuff. Another example of policy is the Korea Free Trade Agreement. Does anyone do trade? Anyone have an interest in trade? Okay, I'll do this.
The whole country has an interest in trade.
What's that?
The whole country has an interest in trade.
Well, it's called KORUS, the Korea Free Trade Agreement. It hasn't passed. It's kind of sitting stuck. But it's interesting because you had, once again, broad left, right, up, down, kind of progressive libertarians, conservatives, liberals coming together in opposition to the Korea Free Trade Agreement, but all for very different reasons. So some of my and I worked on this issue. So some of my friends on the center left were very concerned about loss of American jobs. They're more from the labor side of things, unions, and they thought unions are going to lose members because we're going to lose jobs to the South Koreans. There were some folks on the center left who were human rights activists and were very concerned about the jobs that would be created in North Korea by South Korean companies using slave labor to make parts for goods in the South that would come then to the United States. So a kind of human rights perspective. There were libertarian or conservative or constitutionalist folks who said, wait, look at this trade agreement. It allows Korean companies to take the U.S. government to court in foreign tribunals, meaning the UN or World Trade Organization would take decisions on our behalf, not our elected officials, not our judges, but foreign bodies. And that's kind of post-constitutional, and that's completely inappropriate. We shouldn't allow that to happen. So we got kind of libertarian constitutionalists involved in opposition to the trade agreement. And then we got free traders. People actually believe in free trade who said, what, you don't need 10,000 pages to free trade. I mean, let's look into this. And they look into it and you say, wow, there's all these kind of benefits for certain companies who get their goodies, so they get bought out, and so they join in support of the free trade agreement. Free trade should just be removing the barriers to trade, not providing goodies for the companies that have the political connections. So you had free traders, like I would say real free traders, join in. And then we got the national security conservatives who said, wait, this possibly would allow hard currency from the United States to go through the South into the North through this, what's called the Kaesong Industrial Center, which was a center run by the South in the North to create products. In this case, it would be parts for South Korean products that would come into the United States. Hard currency go up to the North. North is a problem because their nuclear weapons program, they're giving missile technology to the Pakistanis and the Iranians. So the national security conservatives were like, this is maybe not really a good idea. We shouldn't be funding or giving hard currency to our enemies. We need to kind of really look into this. So we organized this kind of broad left-right, up-down coalition in opposition to the free trade agreement. But you didn't have to convince the national security conservatives that human rights were important. You didn't have to convince the free traders that unions were important. Everyone just kind of came together through their own perspective in a broad coalition. And then I'd say the last example of kind of broad-based policy folks, broad-based coalition coming together on policy, is E-Verify. Anyone familiar with E-Verify?
Oh, gun law?
No.
No.
Okay.
I've heard the term, but I can't.
It's a pre-employment screening program.
Oh, yeah.
Where you have to seek, I jokingly say, permission from the federal government to get a job. So what happens is, it's not mandatory yet. There's a bill in the House that would make it mandatory, but it's a pilot program. If it was mandatory, or even as a pilot program, let's say you go seek a job, your employer would ask for certain information from you. You would send the information to Social Security Administration and to the Homeland Security Department, make sure you are who you say you are, the yes comes back, they can hire you. Now, we are putting together a broad coalition against this for multiple different reasons. One, private contracting. You as an employer, let's say you as an employer want to hire her, you should be free to do so without government interference, except for protecting that contract. You should not have to go seek permission from the federal government to employ anyone. There are immigration groups who are concerned that undocumented or illegal aliens would be unfairly harmed by this because it would force them further into the black market, and as they get forced, or in the shadows, as they get forced further into the shadows, they can be taken advantage of and abused, and there's lots of stories of that. You have civil libertarians who say, wow, you're creating huge databases, Homeland Security, Social Security Administration, what other databases are going to be used to prove who you say you are is who you are? This is just a nightmare. And on the flip side of this, we see down the road that they're going to say, well, we have these data points we need from you, your date of birth, your Social Security, your name, but we need more information because there's, identity theft. We need to confirm more. So we're going to use more databases. So why not pull in the Department of Education databases? Or why don't we pull in gun registry databases? So, we're going to look to the gun groups to get involved. But on the other side of this, we are also concerned that they're going to say is, well, the documents that you used to show your employer, they could be forged. So we need a national identity card with a biometric to prove who you say you are. It's called a Real ID. It passed actually in 2005, but it's kind of been killed in the States, so it's lying morbid. But we see that they're going to revive that in order to make E-Verify effective. So you're creating basically a national identification system, which is just, from the civil libertarian point of view, inappropriate for free people in a free country. We bring all these people together in opposition, in this case, to E-Verify. And, you could reverse it, and you guys might say E-Verify is a great thing, or you might say the Patriot Act is a great thing, you might say the Korea Free Trade Agreement is a great thing, and you guys could organize on the other side in the same way. You just find all the strange bedfellows to come together to fight our side of it. It's just a way of thinking about how to organize people politically. So that's the way of thinking about principles and policies in terms of organizing. Any questions before I move into processes?
When you have such different groups coming together on policy issues, how do you then use that? Like, do you send, when you're sending sort of like those letters that like have all these organizations signed on, what kind of content can you put in that letter if everyone's reason is different? Like, what can your message be?
Well, it's actually really good. That's a really good question, because what it usually happens is it breaks down into occasionally subgroup letters. So you might have, like, the unions have their arguments, and they might do a letter specifically to members that are kind of pro-union to let them know. And you might have the more civil libertarians put together a thing specific to civil liberties and go to the few members of Congress who are pro-civil libertarian. So things might divide out that way. But it's really interesting because I've seen letters with 200 to 300 to 400 groups signed on. And you're like, wow. So, in the conversation, when you bring people together in a coalition meeting, like in a room like this, and iron things out, people act as mature adults and they figure out what they can agree to, and then you get this letter that everyone can sign on to. But that doesn't also mean that there might be issues that might only be addressed by a subgroup of them. But that's a good question.
I really like it that you focus on bringing people together to act as mature adults. But something that we don't see a whole lot of is just that in a lot of different spheres, mainly Congress right now. And a lot of these groups have, that you can bring together on any given issue, have disagreements very sharply on some of the corollaries to their principal beliefs. And the fundamentalists in those groups who won't be as rational can really pose a roadblock to the more moderate members of their groups, putting aside those differences that are not as important as the main issue. And so how do you avoid the fundamentalists in a group getting in the way of the more willing to compromise people in the group?
He's my ringer, because that's the third thing. Processes. That's good.
Great.
Okay. So let me tell you a quick story, and then I'll answer that question. I used to advise, then consult for, and then run an organization called Reuniting America. And what we did is high-level leadership retreats, where we take leaders of progressive, libertarian, conservative, and liberal organizations in 3-day retreats outside of D.C., away from their BlackBerries and their staff and everything else. Beautiful settings. Gold Lake in Colorado, Boulder, Colorado. So like, kind of natural settings. Actually, Gold Lake was perfect because there's a small little spot in Gold Lake where their phones would work. And it was the middle of winter, so no one went outside. So it was like no one had any connection to the outside world. But we bring in professional facilitators. And we found, our intention was threefold, and we found three things that emerged from these professionally facilitated meetings. We humanized the political process. So people got to know one another, as opposed to characters on the television that they can throw epithets at and say, oh, you're a knuckle-dragging fascist, or you're a Marxist, blah, 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 or you're, whatever. You get to know each other, and you're like, wow, he's a human being. And the way they facilitated the interactions, what we talked about, where we came from, how our thinking evolved, and why we feel the way we do politically, like what drives our ideology. And that brought the defense barriers down, because you're like, wow, that person doesn't hate poor people, they just have a different philosophy than I do. Or that person doesn't, hate rich people, they just have, they just care, they have a different set of values. We explored values. And it really humanized the process among these people who were really fighting it out politically in Washington, D.C., which is good, because what that allows us to do then is debate ideas as opposed to attack people, which is really important, because we need more debates on ideas as opposed to attacking of human beings. So you can fundraise off attacking of human beings, and and you can get people excited, but in the end, in terms of finding solutions to our problems, you won't find any solutions to your problems. The second thing that came out of these gatherings was finding common ground. Because once the defenses drop, you get to know one another. It's not that your worldview all of a sudden changes and you believe something different than you believed in, but you're a little less stuck in your worldview, and you're willing to engage in a conversation and say, wow, even through my worldview, there's a lot of common ground. We can actually find ground to work together. We can agree to disagree. We don't have to be disagreeable, but there's a lot of common ground. And I've already listed the Patriot Act and out of the Fed, and all those things are kind of examples of people saying, let's put our differences aside and work together. And the third thing, and this is kind of getting to your question, that emerges is it seems like when you bring two or more people together who are locked in their perspective, locked into they have the answer to whatever question's being asked, and you gauge them this way, the defenses drop and they have a conversation. If you have two people, sometimes a third idea can emerge that either one of them would not have thought of on their own, because they're locked into, they have the answer. And the third idea that emerges doesn't violate their perspective. It generates from their perspective, but it also generates from the other person's perspective, and offers them a way of working in the world differently. Like, wow, we never thought about this. This is interesting. Let's pursue this. And to answer your question about kind of the more radical or fundamentalists in a group, they are actually useful and necessary. I think it's a mistake to say we should all move to the center and kind of eject more extreme views, because that does two things. One, the extreme views go underground and could in fact become dangerous in the long run. Second, those extreme views, if integrated appropriately, provide kind of excitement into the system, which can generate these new ideas. As an example, Social Security, which as a more libertarian person, I wouldn't have been a fan of being created in the 30s and stuff, was a third-party idea, from what I understand. It wasn't from the Democrats, it wasn't from the Republicans. I think it was from the socialist movement in the United States. And there was concern amongst the Democrats and the Republicans at the time that this would gain traction and both parties would lose power, and the kind of the socialist movement would come in. And at the time, socialism was pretty radical, and I guess in the United States it might still be. But it was usurped. It's like, wow, we steal this idea and we should run with it, and then now we have Social Security. And obviously it has difficulties financially and needs some structural changes. But it serves a lot of people, and it served a lot of people for a long time, and people seem to be quite happy with it. But it was a pretty radical idea. So I think if you integrate the more hardcore through this process that I'm discussing, their ideas have a space to emerge, and in kind of in a useful conflict with everyone else, something can come out of it. I think it's a mistake to kind of jettison the extremes of anything, because as I said, that's in many cases interesting ideas can come from. And that actually leads me to, well, actually, so that's the process. Bring these people together for these purposes. And it's interesting. I was just thinking about this yesterday. It's like I hear people say, "Wow, that's really cool that you can do that with people in the political field." But you people do, we human beings, we do that all the time. I mean, I can't imagine when you first started dating your partner that, you know, you found out where they stood on something and started attacking them. I mean, it's like, who does that except in the political sphere? You ask questions, you get to know them, where they come from, why they believe that, either whether religion or politics or social issues. I mean, I think it'd be the first and last date if you started attacking your potential new partner. And so in our lives, and with our friends, we probably do that. I mean, we might challenge our friends on some of their behaviors, some of their worldviews, but we do so because we care about them. We don't do so because we want to like jettison them and throw them in the corner and lock them away. So in our lives, we actually relate to people the way I'm discussing, which I think our politics should do the same. And it's interesting too, because the processes I'm discussing, which humanize the political process, find common ground, create new ideas, is not just limited to politics. You find these divisions in all areas of human activity. So for instance, healthcare. You have conventional medicine, you have Chinese medicine, you have Ayurvedic medicine, you have naturopathic medicine. You have all these schools of medicine. Everyone says that they're the right ones, they have the right answer, they can cure every problem that's known to man, or soon we're on the cutting edge of curing all the problems known to man, and they fight each other. And the conventional guys say, oh, that's all woo-woo. And the naturopaths might, I'm making broad generalizations, and the naturopaths might say, well, there's drugs, it's all corporate welfare, you know, we're destroying our health with all these drugs. You know, it's the same process. I would suggest that as in politics, liberals, conservatives, progressive, libertarians, and other ways of organizing the world have limited but partial truths about how the world works. There's something there. Like there's some truth to how they see the world and how they think it should work. Just as my medical example, conventional medicine has some truths, Chinese medicine has some truths, Ayurvedic, naturopathic. The idea is like, well, let's get these people in a room together and create a bigger model of what health actually means and have this conversation. And maybe if we all work together, we can come up with a more comprehensive, larger model of health and healthcare, as opposed to I have the answer, let's fight each other. And that leads me to the fourth thing, is mapping the body politic, power dynamics and transitions that we're in. Now, mostly in DC, the debate is this. Here's the body politic, here's the left, here's the right, liberal, Democrats, Republicans, and they fight. And it's the limit of their ideas. So it's like that little circle there. And on occasion, they split the difference in the middle, and that's called bipartisanship. I would suggest, just like the example I gave in medicine, is that the body politic is really this big. There are so many more ideas out there, ways of thinking about cultural forms and social organizations and economic systems, political systems. Like as many human beings as there are, there's probably that many ways of thinking about how we should organize ourselves multidimensionally, like in economics and socially and culturally and politically. And what the transpartisan process and mapping does, it allows us to say it's not this, it's this. And if we create this bigger map of who we really are as human beings, as a species on this planet, we have that many more possible solutions to our problems, new ways of thinking about the problems that we face. And I think this, as a way of thinking and working together, is much more valuable than this, because we kind of see where this has gotten us. You know, we're $14 trillion in debt, unfunded liabilities, $70 trillion in unfunded liabilities for Medicare and Social Security down the road. You know, unsustainable. I think this would allow us to start creating new institutions that are a little bit more sustainable, because new ideas can emerge. And that's where I want to get into transitions, because what I think what's happening in our country and in the world today is that we're transitioning, it's not that I think I see it, from an industrial model to a post-industrial or information age model. And what's happening is a lot of our institutions, including our governing institutions, are industrial-based models. They're from the 18th, 19th century, 20th century, actually the 19th and 20th century. We've moved beyond that. And I think because we've moved beyond it, the structures and the institutions are kind of falling apart. Healthcare is not working very well. Our education systems doesn't really educate too many people. I mean, you can see the dropout rates and inability of people to speak and write English very well, do math, science, all those things are kind of dropping. So various ways of organizing ourselves, whether it's education or health or even families, things seem to be just disintegrating. I think that's because we're transitioning. And as you transition to a new period, the older ways of organizing get scared because they see something going on, and they look to entrench their power. And I think that's where you see a lot of the corporate state collusion. Big business, big government getting together, kind of fighting against any kind of change. And I do natural medicine issues and healthcare issues as well. And I see big pharma, big insurance, big government, FDA, FTC, USDA, they get together and they say, well, we don't like this new organic food movement. We don't like these co-ops. It's too threatening to our systems as they are presently organized. We don't like this natural medicine stuff because it's, it's a threat to conventional medicine. So we will use the power of the state to put barriers up, make it more difficult for doctors to practice this medicine, make it more difficult for farmers to provide, organic food in local communities. They are fighting a fight that, unfortunately, in many cases are winning, but eventually they're going to lose because those institutions in which they're trying to protect are falling apart, and we're transitioning to new ones. And I think this, what I mentioned earlier, is necessary to help us think through what are the next institutions that we need to create for the 21st century. What's appropriate for us in terms of medicine? What's appropriate for us in terms of education? And I would suggest that the new model in terms of information technology would say a multitude of answers must be explored. The 20th century seemed to be like, oh, there's one way of doing it. There's one education system. The education system is we all sit in a row. We have the teacher at the front teaching us whatever. We ring the bell. We move to the next class. They teach us whatever. They ring the bell. They teach us, move to the next class. It's a very industrial set model because it did. It prepared people for the factories. It was actually created to prepare people for the factories because you needed to respond to the bell. Things needed to be broken up into segments. It couldn't be looked at holistically. So this model is great for the industrial system. We're in the information age. This doesn't work so well. I mean, I have some critiques of the young people coming up in terms of some of their behaviors, but they're less inclined to do this. They're more thoughtful, and they're like, well, wait, that's not really suiting me. I learn differently than that. The one-size-fits-all doesn't work now. I don't think it really did work, but it fit the models at the time. Like, for instance, I'm a visual learner. If you try to teach me differently, it's really difficult for me. You might be an auditory learner. You might be a kinesthetic learner. Our education system doesn't take into consideration how you learn, how you best learn, how I best learn, and it's one size fits all. Our medicine is very similar to that, and our other ways of organizing are very similar. We are moving away from the one size fits all way of thinking about things and organizing, and we need to keep that in mind, or we're just going to continue to support failing institutions. So, just kind of going back. Any questions on the transitions and the body politic from this to this? Yes, ma'am.
Are you referring to the New World Order when you do this?
No, I'm just,
You're referring to what goes on in our country.
Well, just what's possible within the human imagination. I mean, it could be the whole world, but I will only work on American issues for the most part. I'm just saying that our policymakers think this narrowly, and they fight over this. I'm suggesting that we as human beings are much more creative than that, and we have this. I would even say this is like three-dimensional. I can't really show that, but we have the potential of being much more creative, and we are in our private lives. I mean, I'm sure we do things a lot differently in our private lives than the limitations that our present-day systems put into place. We're like, oh, okay, that's nice, but we're going to do things I do things a little bit differently in my private life.
Yes, sir. Is this an argument for more political parties?
It could be an argument for more political parties. I don't make that argument. I happen to lean more libertarian, so I like to see the power of the state much more reduced and things taken, decisions taken more in the social sphere, where people come together cooperatively as opposed to coercively to the state. But in fact, for broadening the discussion, I can't see any problems with more political parties, or at least the ones we have being able to participate in the process. I mean, it's kind of sad when you see the presidential debates. The Republicans, standard bearer, and the Democrat, and the Green guy, and the Libertarian guy, and the Reform Party guy, and whoever else, the other party, are not included, which limits the ability of the American people to hear other options. So yeah, I don't run around saying that's my answer, but that is an answer to the broader question of just expanding who we are as a people in terms of the knowledge base and ideas and possible solutions to the problems that we face. Yes, sir.
Building off that point, it seems like this transpartisanship idea seems really great, but it would require a radical reform in terms of government. We might need to see more states' rights. We'd have to abolish the electoral college and the winner-take-all system, things like that. It seems like it would maybe require constitutional changes, or just, like you're saying, these powers that be are so entrenched. I don't see how, it's hard to see how we at this level can affect them without some sort of incredibly radical movement.
Well, I would suggest yes, I mean, it's going to be really difficult because you have entrenched powers that are going to fight against any kind of changes, but you do see an opening to the 10th Amendment in this country, an interest in devolving power back to the states, with a recognition that historically there's been problems. You know, states' rights have been kind of historically a bugaboo, but you know, constitutionally it's appropriate. The federal government actually has limited powers, and the rest should go after the states or to the people. And the fact that there is more interest in the 10th Amendment is a good thing. But I would say, independent of the politics, there are movements happening in this country that are almost saying, F the politics. As an example, there's a city council in, I think, in Washington, maybe, Seattle, Washington, that said that they will not comply with FDA and USDA standards when it comes to food. They like their farmers. They want their farmers to provide the goods and services to their local community because they know each other, because they live in the same community. And they're not going to let these new standards, I think that were passed about 18 months ago, which would actually make it more difficult for these co-ops to exist, to affect these interchanges. I think that's wonderful. I think there's a town in Maine that says food sovereignty. We're not, you know, we are a sovereign people. We are not going to let the federal government or even the states tell us how we want to live our lives in terms of our food. So there are like little things emerging. Education-wise, I don't know what you think about the homeschool movement. I mean, there's some pros and cons, but the fact is that you have 2 million, I think, young people who are being homeschooled. It might not be the answer for everyone. Some people need traditional schooling. Some people need military schooling. You know, you want a whole bunch of options, but homeschooling is kind of a nice bulwark against the conventional thinking of kind of the corporate state industrial model. You have democratic free schooling and unschooling. Are you familiar with unschooling? It's like the radical version of homeschooling. It's one of my favorites to read about. So children are naturally curious, and parents in our education system destroys the curiosity of the children because parents don't like rambunctious children running around. You want to kind of control them a little bit. I'm making broad generalizations. I don't know how you guys parent it. But you know, you kind of want to make sure your children are safe and not too rambunctious running around. And our education system doesn't like curious children because they interfere with sitting and responding to the bell. Unschooling says, well, we're going to reverse that. Children are naturally curious. Parents who do this unschooling as a philosophy say, we're going to allow the child to pursue their interests. We're going to support them in their interests, but the child will be self-directed. And it's age appropriate. I mean, you're not going to let a 2-year-old just kind of run down the street and do whatever they want. I mean, you know, you have to have some sense of security for the child. But in terms of their intellectual curiosity, you just let them pursue their own interest. It's a homeschooling movement, but it's the radical version of homeschooling. So the best story that I think I've heard is I think this kid really liked comic books. So his parents just let him start reading comic books, and he wanted to start drawing comic books. So he started drawing. So he's just learning how to draw on his own. In order to do comic books, he needed to learn how to write, because he needed to do the captions. So they taught him how to write. Eventually got to the point where he wanted to produce a comic book, like for his neighbors and stuff. So he had to figure out how to actually do mass production of something. So his parents let him do that. Eventually became he's a little kid, but eventually became a business for him. So he learned kind of economics. So he learned to draw, he learned math, because he had to do the economics, he learned production, he learned writing, he learned all these things just because of his curiosity and interest in comic books. Now, if he went to school and said, I want to read comic books, of course they're going to say no. I mean, because you could just imagine, because all the kids are just going to read their comic books and nothing's going to get done. But on an individual level, his parents let him pursue his curiosity, led him to learn all the things that he needed to learn, but in a more holistic way and a self-interested way. So he wasn't like forced to do it. It was his own interest. And I think that as a model is useful, because if we are freer in our lives to pursue our own interests, pursuit of happiness, I think we are much happier. I think we'll treat each other a little bit differently. And we have less interest in using coercion against other people. You must live my way, you must live my way. No, I live my way. I will be a model to you if you're interested, and perhaps you will follow my path, as opposed to, I'm going to use the power of the state to force you to do stuff. Another interesting model is democratic free schools. Are you guys, anyone familiar with democratic free schools? Okay. So, our present-day conventional industrial model for schooling, the child is silent, the teacher is the expert and teaches. And I don't want to seem like this is a value judgment, that's evil and bad. I'm just saying that that's a model from the industrial time. It might be appropriate for some, even in the post-industrial time. But I don't think it's a completely one-size-fits-all. Everyone's different, and certain models are different for different people. Democratic free schooling says the children, depending on their age, should participate in the decision-making of the classroom. They come up with the rules and with the teacher. I mean, that's just not free reigning, but they help come up with the rules that all children in that class have to follow, and they are responsible for implementing them. So if they come up with a rule that says, you know, we all have to be in our seats by the time the bell rings, we all agree to that, and a child's playing doesn't, and is kind of acting poorly, whatever rule they come up with in terms of a punishment from the child, they will implement. The teacher will implement, but the children are responsible for coming up with the rules. What should be taught? How should it be taught? They don't have complete reign, it's not anarchy, but they participate in the decisions. What's really interesting about that model is that teaches people, as they grow up, to be more participatory in their own lives. They help set the rules, they help set what's studied, they work in cooperation with other people. So by the time they are adults, they are big D Democrats. I mean, they are autonomous human beings that know how to work in a collective with other people, as opposed to, like, you sit there and you're told what to do. That model doesn't necessarily produce people who are autonomous, authors of their own lives, able to work with other people. That produces people who possibly are followers of other people and they're told what to do.
But if you're a teacher, that's the other side of the story. Because if you have 50 children in a classroom of kindergartners, I mean, there has to be some kind of regimentation to get them quiet. You know, it's all that kind of thing.
Yes, ma'am. And
then if you have chaos, you cannot teach.
It's staged. That model is stage developed. So
I sort of think it had to do with the need for teaching from the teacher's point of view.
Well, a larger question might be is why is there 50 people in a little class?
Well, that was an extreme case, but you know, you do have to have some kind of discipline.
And I'm not arguing against that. I'm just in the model I just laid out. It's staged, meaning based on this stage of the child's development. So it might be more appropriate for 5-year-olds to have a lot more regimentation, and you can give a little bit more freedom to a 9-year-old to participate in the decision-making process, and even more freedom to a 12-year-old. And it's also individualized because, as everyone knows, there's 5-year-olds who act better than 9-year-olds, and there are probably 10-year-olds who act better than a lot of 35-year-olds that we know. You know, so it's all individualized, and I'm making broad generalizations.
Yeah.
And I'm only mentioning models that are being practiced on a small scale. I don't think you could scale some of these things to everyone. First of all, it's inappropriate because that's not appropriate for everyone. And secondly, there are certain conventions. You know, when you move from one model, from the industrial model to the post-industrial model, you don't want to jettison everything, because some things work, and perhaps that model is useful for the majority of people. But you want to start opening the space for inclusion of new ways of doing things. So it's transcend and include. It's not transcend and reject, if that makes sense. Cool. Okay. And then the last piece of the kind of the transpartisan mapping is power dynamics, and I think this is kind of interesting. So, from the libertarian conservative perspective, it's the individual versus the state. You know, the state has a coercive power, it's a monopoly on the use of force, And from the individual perspective, you want to limit that power against you because it's destructive to human lives. From some of my friends on the center left who are more progressive, they say it's, the state's a problem, but it's the corporations are the real problem. And whether you're an employee, a consumer, or a citizen, those different ways of relating to the corporate world is problematic. If you're an employee, you have no rights, they can screw you. If you're a consumer and they have too much power, they limit your choices in the marketplace. If you're a citizen, they can buy politicians. ACLU is calling me, actually. It's kind of funny. So that's the kind of critique of the left. And then you have some folks who say, well, it's not about individual in the corporations or the individual in the state. It's about socioeconomics. Are you a worker or you're an owner? Some people say, no, it's about gender, male versus female, patriarchy versus non-patriarchy. You have others who say it's straight versus the gay world. You have others who say it's ethnic, or it's racial, it's blacks and whites, or other variations of the ethnic racial divide. And a lot of people will say, whichever perspective they hold, that's the answer. That is the way to analyze every situation that we face. It's this, and that's the way to analyze it. Using the transpartisan model, because that perspective is this. The transpartisan model would say, no, we need to be a little bit more broad. Perhaps the analysis of the individual versus state is true, and I think it is, but it's only a piece of the puzzle. Perhaps the employer versus, or the employer in the relationship to the employee versus in the relationship to the employer, the consumer in relationship to the business, the citizen in relationship to business. There's some truth there, but doesn't answer everything. Socioeconomics, there's some truth there. It doesn't answer everything. Gender, there's some truth there. I mean, I would say that women are in a much better position than they were 50 years ago, but perhaps in many localities here in the United States or in certain relationships, they're not equal partners. There's still limitations. Maybe it might not be as institutionalized as it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but there's still problems that need to be addressed, but I don't think that answers everything. And then all the other racial, ethnic, straight, gay, all those dynamics, power dynamics, there's some truth, but they're limited. So the idea is, let's look at all of them. Let's say that there's some truth there, but let's not get confused with truth, with the answer for everything. And just like we did with the kind of various ways of organizing politically, and all the different worldviews, let's do the same with power. Let's create a bigger map of the world we live in, and say, yeah, you're right. There's some truth there, but that's not the only truth. But how do we address that in the context of these other ways of analyzing the situation? And I'm only suggesting that we need to be a little bit more complex in our thinking. We need to take seriously people's experiences in the world, people's perspectives in the world, the way they analyze the world, and create as big of a playing field for all of us to work together. Because at least here in the United States, we're facing some major problems: healthcare, education, the national debt, eventual bankruptcy of Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare. These are some really huge problems, and if we don't all come together in these various ways, and it doesn't have to be just the ways I've laid out, but some ways of coming together, thinking differently than we have, I don't think we have a good future, both for us and then for our future generations. So I'm hoping that this message will resonate to some degree or another. We'll take pieces of it and say, yeah, maybe we should start thinking slightly differently, see how we can bridge the divide and work together. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, I was really intrigued by your suggesting that we're transitioning from industrial to post-industrial or information age. And so I kind of have two questions to that. First off, would it be fair to also characterize that as a transition from class identification to greater emphasis on personal responsibility?
It's actually interesting. From the research that I've seen, one's identity, we were in agriculture when our country was first formed. We were late-stage agriculture, early industry. Now we're late industry, industrial, early information age. As you transition, one's identity becomes loosened up. You're no longer identified by one or two things. You have identities in you. So you can't, like 300 or 400 years ago, you would have been whatever you're called. I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Jew, and I'm a Virginian. I'm a yeoman farmer. I mean, your identity 400 or 500 years ago was who you are. If you look over time, getting up to today, your identity, you're no longer identified by one or two things. You have multiple identities that come out of you. You can be a Christian, you can be a yeoman farmer, but you play other roles in your life. The possibility of roles expands, especially for women. I mean, you see that, you go back 100 years, the roles of women were quite narrow. Today, women have many more roles they play, and they're identified in many more ways. Well, all human beings over the past 400 or 500, or even further back, our identities are expanding and becoming much more flexible, which is problematic for people who like, to only see people in very narrowed identities. And it's also can be very troublesome for people who are kind of breaking out of that mold and playing around with new roles and new identities. Because you're trying, as a person psychologically, you're trying new things, and it's can be kind of scary, especially if you don't have the cultural support to try new things. But I would say there's two forces at play. One is more responsibility for who you are in the world, because we actually have more freedom now as human beings in this country than we did 400 years ago, culturally speaking, to try new things. And we have in the opposite direction what I would say kind of the corporate state collusion, which works to limit our freedom. So it's like these two competing forces, one locking us into the old system, or trying to lock us into the old system, and then the cultural forms moving in the other direction, giving us more and more freedom to identify ourselves slightly differently or more flexibly. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think, Mike, about what I just said?
I think that is a novel way to conceive of how things are shifting anymore, and why things do seem to be getting worse in a lot of ways, just generally. But something that leads me to is if we have greater personal responsibility, how are we going to prevent people from just reshuffling into new classes of identity, and just depending on what's personally appealing to them? Because if there are a lot of more demagogues available, how are we going to prevent people from being, of their own personal choice, classed into these new systems rather than being more autonomous?
Your question actually points to something really important, because I think there's research to show that people are kind of, through the information they receive online and who they spend their time with, they're kind of organizing themselves in their own little cliques and kind of disappearing from the rest of the world. And that's you're saying that, is that accurate what I just said in terms of your question? Yes. And that's a problem. Yes. I mean, I think we're in the midst of an experimentation. So I think it'd be almost premature to say that that's a problem that needs to be solved. It's more like, oh, that's interesting. Let's see how that unfolds. Because I think during transitional times, things that we see, are we seeing it from the old paradigm and saying, wow, there's a problem? Are we seeing it from the new paradigm? We're not really in the new paradigm completely. So I'm kind of hesitant to do one-size-fits-all things and say, critiquing that is the problem that needs to be solved. I would be curious to see how that unfolds. Once people start organizing themselves in their own little communities, do eventually those communities expand to start including others? Because it seems to me like that's kind of human nature. Like, we're kind of tribal, and we kind of do organize around tribes. But if you look historically over time, tribes interact, expand and grow, expand and grow, expand and grow. New ideas emerge, new cultural forms emerge through those interactions, as long as they're peaceful. And perhaps people need to, at this time, with both fear and scared, they're scared and stuff, and freedom, to organize this way, because it serves some useful purpose in the short run, which will then allow them in the longer run to move out. Perhaps it's like a child, for parents in the room, that a little baby goes out in the world a little bit and then comes back to the mom or the father and goes back out in the world a little bit. There's a sense of safety, and I think that's kind of ingrained in us, that we like to be around people that make us feel safe, at our own kind, or whatever that means. The way people who think like us, act like us, dress like us. You know, we have a tendency, I think, for some human beings to like that. But over time, as we become more comfortable, perhaps we move out a little bit, interact with the world, and see what's going on out there, and see that there's people who don't think, act, dress, and eat like we do, and it's kind of cool. You interact with them, and those interactions create more fun for ourselves, more excitement for ourselves, and in terms of food, better food options. Is that, yes sir?
A lot of the transpartisan coalitions that you described seem to be composed primarily of people from outside the status quo. So how do you deal with people who have entrenched interests in the way that things are now, basically like the vested interests in terms of school reform, the teachers' unions?
Really good question, and one thing I failed to say throughout this whole thing is the way I've talked about this is about people organizing against the state, okay, or against the corporate state, and that's only half true. Because I would say that the way I've said that is actually a failure on my part to also say that the state is made up of individuals just like you and me who work they work jobs. Unions are made up of people just like you and me. They work. Everyone has entrenched interests. I mean, I want to protect my interests. It's kind of human nature. So, in a truly transpartisan way, instead of making the teachers' unions the bad guys or whoever you said, educationalists, and the entrenched interest in many cases are fearful of losing what little they have. In most cases, how can you work with them as opposed to make them the enemy? How can you create a system where they win and you win? On any particular issue, I don't have an answer. That would take everyone who has vested interest in whatever issue you're talking about to actually sit down, perhaps in a professionally facilitated environment, perhaps over coffee, and start having conversations. Because it's interesting because I've met with Homeland Security people and TSA people and FBI guys and people from national security agencies and stuff, and they're no different than you or me. I mean, you guys might. You guys might be some of them. They're just human beings. Like they're trapped. They're in a system in which they're trying to do their best job, both protecting their interests, which is kind of human nature, protecting the interests of the agency, which is kind of human nature, and hopefully a greater vision of protecting the interests of the country. But sometimes they don't always, any human being, match. But if you treat them like human beings and sit down with them and talk to them, in many cases, just like I said, you can drop the defenses when you're talking to someone from a different political perspective. In conversations with these people from the other side of whatever issue you're working on, you can find some common ground. And it might not unfold exactly how you wanted it to, it might not look how you wanted it to, but it might be a move in a positive direction, and it might be a move in a direction that you've never thought of, and they would never thought of, once you guys start having a conversation. So I would suggest, politically you always have to have the enemy. As a civil libertarian, it's usually the state. It's an institution that's kind of amorphous, it's out there, no one likes it. They like the state for their own specific issues, they don't like the state for other issues. But keep in mind that it's just made of people. And I'll give you a really good example. I used to go to pharma lunches, pharmaceutical manufacturers' lunches, years ago. And I work on natural medicine. And I happen to support a free market, so I think there should be a free market in medicine too. There's too much regulations. But I'm not a big fan of how drugs are promoted, and every time you have an itch, you take a drug, and then you have to get another drug to deal with the side effect of the first drug. It's a systemic problem. But I wouldn't keep people from buying drugs if they wanted to do so. But I would sit in these lunches, and we'd have a presentation of some drug manufacturer talking about the latest issue that they're dealing with the FDA. And it's kind of interesting. But you talk to the people around the table during the lunch, before the conversation, before the talk starts, and I'd say, oh yeah, I do natural medicine. And they'd say, oh my God, yeah, my wife does acupuncture for her back problem. And this other person would say, oh yeah, I take vitamin C when blah, 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 or I take echinacea, or whatever herb of the day might have been. So it was just like everyone at the table that I spoke to was involved in natural medicine. The institutions that they work for fight against their interest in participating in the natural medicine world out of self-interest. So there's this divide. It's like them in their private lives are free in experimenting with alternative medicine. The institutions they work for, out of fear and control, fight against their choices. I think if we sat down with them as human beings and said, do you realize what's happening through your institution? The political maneuvering is going to actually reduce your opportunities to try these medicines, the natural medicines in the future, maybe they change their mind. As opposed to saying, evil pharmaceutical companies, evil pharmaceutical companies, evil pharmaceutical, because, you know, if I worked for a pharmaceutical company and someone called me evil and started attacking me, I'm not going to go, how am I doing bad things in the world? I'm going to go, you know, I'm going to want to defend myself and fight back. And I would imagine, you know, if you're married, I would hope that with your wife that, you know, the first thing you do when you have a problem is not start yelling at her. You talk to her. Because what happens when you start yelling at someone, or calling them names, or making them the bad guy or the evil one? You know, they usually don't respond very well. Is that, I saw, sir, did you?
No,
Did you have?
everybody is for individual freedom, but I think the problem is the social responsibility.
Yes.
That's what you've got to teach people to be more communal, conscious, not just be for myself. You know, like the great Hillel said, if I'm only for myself, what am I? You know, but you have to be for yourself to a point. But then, in our society, we tend to be, in that sense, anarchists in regard to freedom. So you've got to have a balance between freedom and social responsibility. And that's what's missing, because you have cults in our society. They're cults. You know, the Tea Party is a cult. They want cut spending. That's all they know. That's all they know. That's it.
I doubt he's ever been to a meeting.
That's okay.
No, I'm talking about the congressmen up in the hill. They're talking about cut spending, and they don't want anything else. They don't care about the debt ceiling or unemployment, which, by the way, is really, to me, is incredibly, and nobody talks about it or gives it the priority that it deserves.
And I think it's actually much higher, because I think they don't even count people who are no longer receiving
Yeah,
employment.
absolutely, absolutely.
In terms of your community, I completely agree, because there's no way we can be self-governing if we don't take care of our communities, our families, our neighborhoods, our towns. You know, I think like the democratic free schooling as an example is an example of how you inculcate community building in people. You know, because you are responsible for the community in which you live in this case, the educational community you live in. So a question I would have is, as we transition from an industrial model to the post-industrial model, because the post-industrial model is very agenic. I mean, if you see a lot of young people locked into their devices, it's like they're locked into a little world. It's very little interaction with real people, which it could be a problem down the road. It's something we need to look into. But as we transition, what can we do as people, as a community, to inculcate moral responsibility, whether religious or from a humanistic, secular perspective, that you are your brother's keeper, that you do have some responsibility to your family members, to your community, to your neighbors. I don't have an answer. I think there has to be multiple different answers, and 1,000 experiments tried to inculcate that as a message. Because I think you're right. We have to balance freedom and kind of responsibility, or community and individual and community needs to be balanced. I think it's a mistake to go too far to community, because you lose the individual, and you go too far to the individual, you lose the community. So you're right. There has to be some interaction there that's balancing. And as I said, experimentation. What would allow us to be more community-oriented, but with individuals who are free and autonomous? And I try to look at this as that we're a species playing, experimenting. We don't know everything. We're really like 3-year-old as a person. You know, like we haven't been around that long. We're trying things out. We're kind of silly. We do a lot of stupid things. We're learning, and hopefully we'll figure that out. We'll strike that balance between those two poles. And I'm actually optimistic in the long run, because I think the transitions are really hard, because our institutions are failing us, and our communities are breaking up, and I mean, you probably remember when the family was not just a nuclear family. It wasn't just a mom and a dad and a couple of kids. It was like aunts and uncles, and that annoying neighbor down the street who kept track of your kids, and then just became mom and dad and the kids, and then just became a mom and the kids, and our dad and the kids. You know, so it's, you know, we don't even have the familiar structures as much as we used to. Broadly speaking, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, which itself is problematic, because I think you need, I mean, it doesn't have to necessarily be the way it has been, but we need some kind of systems in place where you care. Like, you know, that kid might not be mine biologically, but he's a neighbor's kid, and I'm not going to let him run across the street. I'm not going to let them get involved in drugs and gangs. You know, some sense of responsibility like there used to be with that annoying neighbor down the hall who would say, "You know what your kid did today?" You know, that I think we need something like that, but maybe new models.
And in turn, that creates a responsibility in the child toward his environment, his community, the people in the community.
Yes, ma'am.
They represent their family, and they're somewhat destined to be ornery.
No, you're exactly right. Actually, my wife and I talked about this because she comes from a small town in Texas, and she'd always tell me that, you know, you can't get away with, back when she was younger, you could never get away with anything. And you were kind of afraid to do bad things because your parents, it's not even that you're, by the time you got to your parents, you're so in trouble before you even got to your parents, because like neighbors and stuff could give you a real hard time and get you in trouble. And there was a sense of responsibility as an individual. It's like, well, you didn't want to let people down. You want to get yelled at. You want to get in trouble. And that inculcates in you that you have a responsibility for the younger kids. You know, I would imagine.
This is clear off the subject, but what organization does the Fed report to? Who's in charge of checking on them? Which part of our government is watching over the Feds?
In theory or actually?
The what?
In theory or actually?
Well, I just like to know why they got away with that.
The Fed is no more Fed than FedEx, actually. It's private bankers, and it's where the real power is, and nobody's keeping an eye out. If they were audited, a lot of people would go to jail.
Yeah, but how do these banks get a hold of our money?
Well, it's actually interesting because although I mentioned that there was very little reporting about the $16 trillion, there was an article in the Washington Post. Never mentioned the money, but it said that there might be conflicts of interest, which is true because you had members of the Federal Reserve who were passing out these trillions of dollars to other companies to which they sat on the boards. You know, it's like, wow. I mean, it's beyond criminal. I mean, Madoff was criminal. That's billions, $20 billion. I mean, it's a big number for people who lost their money, but this is trillions of dollars. That's like mega criminal. But these are the people who kind of seem to control power, and I can't imagine many of them are going to go to jail.
Yeah. I didn't mean to shift the subject,
No.
but that disturbs me greatly. I didn't know what was happening.
Yeah, it's very disturbing, and I'm hoping that after the whole debt deficit fight winds down, that people start paying attention to this, because, you know, we've been fighting and arguing and debating, well, should we have bailed out Wall Street? You know, the $800 billion, that was a huge thing. Wait, $800 billion to Wall Street, what about Main Street? Well, $800 billion is huge, but it pales to $16 trillion. And that's bigger than our economy. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Well, perhaps on a somewhat related note, how do you see an organization like WikiLeaks that has the capacity to expose information on just this kind of topic, huge banking that effectively embezzles trillions of dollars to itself? You know, an organization like that is very new, and so I would think that that figures into the information age very prominently. And how do you see that kind of organization on a topic like that functioning in this transition?
Yeah, let me go a little bit higher than that, then I'll answer my thoughts on WikiLeaks. I think government should be more transparent, and human beings should be more autonomous in the relationship. So we should know much more about what our government does, and they should know a lot less about what we do. That's kind of like my picture of the relationship. But it's reverse. We have no idea what they do, and they know everything that we do. But I think, you know, that it should change. Unfortunately, technology seems to allow them to know more about what we do, but our counter to that is something like WikiLeaks, which allows us to know more what they do. Generally speaking, the more information we have about our government, the better, because that way we can take decisions on our behalf collectively to hopefully pressure the government to do what we think is the right thing versus what they think they should do, irregardless of what they think we think. One of the concerns I have with WikiLeaks, though, is I would be concerned about some of the leaks on national security issues, which could be problematic to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines,
Yes.
and agents abroad. I'm not a big fan of most of our interventions. I opposed Iraq War. I don't want us to go to war in Iran. I don't think we should be in Libya. I think it's unconstitutional. But I definitely don't want to put in. So I would do almost anything to get us out of those conflicts. But I would be very concerned about information out there that would put our guys and our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines in harm's way, and our CIA operatives and other such things. So on those things, I like to see a little bit more reasonable approach to releasing that kind of information. On some of these other things, the more information we have about what our government does, the better. And unfortunately, since a lot of what the government does on our behalf is things that we probably wouldn't want them to do, it's probably good for us to know about that. And let me throw in the corporate world too. Now, I believe in contract rights and such, and that corporate world should be protected in their interactions to a certain degree. But if I was going to have like a hierarchy, I'd say maximum exposure of the government. The next level would be the corporate world, because we have to know what they're doing, because some of the companies are so big, they act like governments, they have more power than governments, they even have their own security forces, their own banks. I mean, some of these companies are pretty damn powerful. And since they take actions that affect us personally, we should know about them. Within limits, because I don't want to violate contracts and patents and things like that. But there should be a little bit more transparency in the corporate world. I don't do a lot of work internationally, but you hear about some of these companies that go into third worlds and just devastate the populations. They steal the land, they steal the resources. I mean, they turn people into basic slave labor. I mean, it's just kind of really destructive. We should know about these things. Especially if these corporations are registered here in the United States, we should know what they're doing. Because in most cases, they're acting with our government to their benefit against third world people. And then the third level will be individuals. A lot less. We should be as free and autonomous. We should know a little bit more about the corporate world, and we should know a lot about the government. Is my thoughts. How about you?
Well, I think that hierarchy makes perfect sense. And if it helps with your worry about how WikiLeaks can endanger government personnel, the New York Times did a fantastic essay on how they worked with WikiLeaks and other major newspapers and the State Department in redacting documents that were published under WikiLeaks, because that organization has a very vested interest in not a single hair on anyone's head being harmed because of information that they release. And the level of responsibility that people like Julian Assange have held themselves to in releasing this information is really surprising. I think we don't hear an awful lot about it. And so I guess that would be my main comment, but mostly I agree with what you're saying about the hierarchies of transparency.
Yeah, it's unfortunate because the technology is making it such that corporations and governments know so much about us. I mean, you probably can't imagine how many databases in the government at the various levels there are about you, about us. Just the corporate databases about us. All our purchases, where we go, who we talk to on the phone, who we talk to on the internet, our texts, our emails, our faxes. Those are records someone's holding. So it's kind of, it's a little scary if you think about it. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you, sir. Thanks.